Hello students. So in this section we are going to discuss about the recent UPSC CMS exam, and specifically I'm going to deal with the pediatric section. This time it was again straightforward. UPSC people, they focus on these selected topics, emergency scenarios, what you're going to do next, public health programs and so on. So have odd 30 questions with me today that we have collected from students, and today I'm going to discuss those 30 questions. So without further ado, let's start. The very first question that we have is from pediatric epilepsy syndrome. Let's see what this question is asking us. So the question goes that which one of the following is a childhood onset epilepsy syndrome that is characterized by multiple seizure types, developmental delay, and slow, that is less than 3 heart spike and wave discharges on EEG. The options we have are juvenile myoclonic epilepsy, Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, mesial temporal lobe epilepsy syndrome, and Rasmussen syndrome. So, a typical triad the examiner has given us. Can you notice the triad? The triad says that we have multiple seizures. That means they can have tonic seizures, absent seizures, typical salam spells, infantile spasms. We have developmental delay. And third, we have a characteristic EEG finding that is slow, less than 3 hearts vacuum wave complex. This triad, where do we see this triad? We see this triad in LGS, that is Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. Right, this is a continuum with the West syndrome category. So usually you see this Lennox-Gastaut syndrome in the age group of 2 to 8 years of age, and in this age group, what usually we see that the untreated West syndrome patients, they evolve into this category. So here you're going to see multiple seizure types, this typical EEG finding, and because of this heavy load of seizures, there is developmental delay. This is nothing but Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. Out of all these options, let us discuss the important ones as well. The very first epilepsy syndrome, that is juvenile myoclonic epilepsy. So where do you see this juvenile myoclonic epilepsy? This you see in adolescent age group, specifically adolescent girls. As the name says, myoclonic epilepsy. So here you see myoclonic jerks. And these myoclonic jerks are precipitated by sleep deprivation and alcohol consumption. Right? Apart from that, mesial temporal lobe epilepsy syndrome is frequently associated with febrile seizure spectrum, and then you have Rasmussen syndrome. In Rasmussen syndrome, usually you see unilateral focal seizures, and there is progressive hemiparesis. Apart from that, you also have absence seizures, which is very important for your exam. So, what do you see in childhood absence epilepsy? You see absent seizures. The age group is the school going age group, 4 to 10 years of age. Here there are brief episodes of vacant staring, and the typical EEG pattern that you are going to see here is very important for your exam, that is 3 heart spike and wave complex. Spike and wave complex. Remember, ethosuximide is the drug of choice, which is a very frequently asked question in your exam. If ethosuximide is not in the option, then go for valproate. Right, so these are the important childhood epilepsy syndromes, very important for this UPSC CMS exam, and as well as your IGNICT exam, FMG exam, NEET PG exam, a hot favorite topic from the section of pediatrics. So now let's move to the second question. It is about infections. Again, fever with the rash, a very important section. You read it in pediatrics, you read it in microbiology, you read it in PSM. So, a very important topic again. So, the question goes that exanthem subitum is caused by the infection of which of these viruses? We have 4 options out of here. We have HHV, that is human herpes virus 6, hepatitis B virus, human herpes 7, hepatitis C virus. And we have to choose the correct code over here. We have options 2 and 4, 1 and 2, 1 and 3, and 3 and 4. So let's revise this exanthem subitum, what it is. So this exanthem subitum is also known as roseola infantum. Roseola infantum. So this roseola infantum, also famously earlier was known as the sixth disease. It is a very acute but self-limiting viral condition in early childhood. And 2 major viruses that you need to keep in your mind when we are discussing this condition is HHV6 and 7, right? And out of this HHV6, remember 6B. This actually accounts for more than 90% of the cases of this exanthem subitum, and remaining 5 to 10% cases is by this HHV7. Right? Now, the typical height points that you need to know from your exam. Firstly, the typical age group where do you see the sixth disease? The age group. What is the age group that you see? Usually in younger children, 6 months to 2 years of age, and peak incidence is about 9 to 12 months of age, right? So broadly 6 months to 2 years of age, you see this. You see here that there is sudden onset of high grade fever that usually lasts for around 3 to 5 days, and this will happen in an otherwise active child, well looking child. Firstly, the rash appears as the fever disappears over here. So initially you have this sudden onset high grade fever, and as soon as this fever disappears, the rash appears. The fever breaks abruptly by the crisis, and there is this non-pruritic rose pink colored maculopapular rash that starts from the trunk and then spreads to the extremities and the face. This is the typical thing. And what again an important pointer that you need to know here for your exam is Nagayama spots that you see. These are the erythematous papules that you see on the soft palate and uvula. And the common complication, a very common complication and a very important pointer for your exam is that this HHV6 specifically is neurotropic, and it is a leading cause of febrile status epilepticus in younger infants less than 2 years of age. Right? So febrile seizure are a very important complication. Febrile seizure epilepticus. Right? So these are the important pointers regarding the exanthem subitum. Fever with the rash, very important. Need to revise them just before the exam, because out of these 6 or 7 odd fever with rash cases, at least one the examiner tries to ask here and there, either in the form of a microbiology question or a pediatric scenario like here. Okay, so now let's move to the next question. Again, fever with rash thing. Slap cheeked infection is caused. Slap cheek is caused by the infection of which of the following virus? No points for guessing. We don't even need to read the options over here. We all know parvovirus B19 has this slap cheeked appearance, right? So a very straightforward question it was. Now let's move to the next question. We have a 3-year-old boy who is brought with barking cough, right? Barking cough, an important pointer. Noisy breathing for 2 days. He also has a history of prodromal symptoms like running nose, fever over the last 3 to 4 days. Examination reveals that the child has a respiratory rate of 40 per minute. There are subcostal retractions and stridor. The most important step in management is, if you are appearing for the UPSC CMS exam, then definitely these type of questions you are going to encounter left, right, and center. Right? What would be the next step? What would be the important points in the management? So you need to think clinically when you are appearing for this exam. So you all understand for now that this barking cough scenario, noisy breathing, prodromal phase before respiratory distress, all of this is pointing towards which condition? Barking cough, the typical condition. What is this? This is nothing but croup, right? So this is nothing but croup. How did you recognize that this is croup? Firstly, there was a viral prodrome, right? The cough, running nose, fever lasting for 3 to 4 days. Then the typical feature, that is barking cough, also known as seal-like cough. This is again typical. Then you have stridor also, inspiratory stridor. Right? And you see signs of respiratory distress also. So if we go towards the management, then we all understand that when we talk about croup or laryngotracheobronchitis, the causative organism is a virus, the para-influenza viruses. And the management here depends upon the severity of croup. So if it is mild croup, there will be no stridor at rest. If there is moderate to severe croup, there is stridor at rest, and there will be this respiratory distress sign. So in this condition, we are dealing with moderate to severe croup. So when we talk about the management of moderate to severe croup, the management has initially nebulization with racemic mixture of adrenaline. This is for that rapid decrease in the edema of the airway. And the second would be corticosteroid. You can give oral dexamethasone or IV dexamethasone, or we can also give nebulization with budesonide, right? So the very typical step, the next step in the management would be, the immediate step would be nothing but nebulization with adrenaline, right? So option A would be correct over here. So this is a very typical scenario. You also see such clinical scenarios in ENT. This topic is covered in ENT as well. Now let's move to the next question. We have a 3-year-old boy who presents to the emergency room with seizures. He has been receiving oral phenytoin since the age of 6 months, and he has a history of epileptic spasm despite the therapy. The examination reveals that there are some hypopigmented lesions over the chest, and MRI shows subependymal nodules. Which of the following would be the drug of choice over here? We have options like oral phenytoin, oral zonisamide, topiramate, and oral vigabatrin. So firstly, looking at the scenario, this is a 3-year-old boy who has history of epileptic spasms. Despite the therapy, he is having spasm here and there. And a typical feature, hypopigmented lesions of the body. These typical hypopigmented lesion points towards ash leaf macules that you see in tuberous sclerosis, and the supporting MRI feature is subependymal nodules. So this is nothing but typical infantile spasms that you see in tuberous sclerosis, and we all know when you encounter infantile spasm in tuberous sclerosis, the drug of choice is vigabatrin. Remember, these infantile spasms or West syndrome like picture, it could be either idiopathic or cryptogenic, where there is no underlying deformity, right? So in cryptogenic cases, the underlying brain is normal. And in cases of symptomatic West syndrome, you have underlying problem. As in tuberous sclerosis, you have the subependymal nodules. So in these cases, the prognosis overall is poor. Here, the drug of choice will depend upon the condition. If there is tuberous sclerosis, the drug of choice is vigabatrin. Otherwise, if you look at the our textbooks, our standard textbooks, then they say that the drug of choice in West syndrome is going to be ACTH or steroids. If you have to choose one, choose steroids, right? So ACTH or steroids. So this is about this condition. Moving to the next question, a 10-year-old girl presents to the emergency with high-grade fever of 2 weeks duration and rashes over the lower limbs. Right? There is high-grade fever over 2 weeks and rashes over the lower limbs for last 7 days. On examination, you see mild pallor, PTK, hepatosplenomegaly. Right? All important points. Then the investigation, you see hemoglobin 9, that means anemia is there. Borderline leukocyte count 2100, platelet count of 20,000. That means there is thrombocytopenia. Peripheral smear has pancytopenias, SGOTs 50, PT 64. Ferritin levels are 1200 and fibrinogen is 100 and triglyceride is 350. The exam tip from my side, whenever you see this ferritin, fibrinogen, triglyceride, always and always think about conditions like HLH, MAS, macrophage activation syndrome, right? All of these conditions, in there only the examiner wants to test whether you know the criteria or not, right? So if you look at this condition, a very straight away feature the examiner is telling you. What the examiner is telling you? This is classical HLH, that is hemophagocytic lymphohistiocytosis. So what is the criteria for HLH? For HLH, you either need the molecular diagnosis or at least 5 out of 8 of the clinical and lab parameters. Firstly, there has to be fever, prolonged high grade fever that we have mentioned over here. There is fever for 2 weeks. Second is splenomegaly. Again, the examiner has given hepatosplenomegaly. Right, so a clinically palpable spleen is considered. Third would be cytopenias, more than 2 cell lines. Here we have pancytopenia. Given in the scenario, the hemoglobin was 9, platelets were 20,000, total leukocyte count was also 2100. Then they say hyperferritin, that is more than 500 microgram per liter. Here we have more 1200 cross to 1200, again fulfilling the criteria. Then you have hypofibrinogen. Hypofibrinogen. This is a single one, hypofibrinogen. Here the cutoff that is given is less than 150, where we have in the question we have 100. Then uh, we have hemophagocytosis in the bone marrow aspirate. You see that there is the typical hemophagocytosis picture. Then lower absent NK cell count, elevated CD5 levels. So all of these 8 points, out of those 4 we have 5 we have seen already in the stem. We have no clue about the NK count or CD5 levels or hemophagocytosis because they have not given any biopsy finding out here. So it is fulfilling the 5 criteria. So 5 out of 5 of the tested criteria that have mentioned in the exam are fulfilled. So this is nothing but HLH. Now why other options are incorrect? So let's first see aplastic anemias. In aplastic anemia, we all know what is there. There is pancytopenia because of the bone marrow failure. But there won't be any hepatosplenomegaly, there won't be any hyperferritinemia, any hypofibrinogenemia, any hypertriglyceridemia. Second is ITP. What happens in ITP? There is isolated antibody mediated destruction of the platelets that leads to thrombocytopenia, but there will be normal hemoglobin, normal white cell count. There won't be any splenomegaly, any fever, any hypertriglyceride, right? So again, we omit this option. What about APML? This can cause pancytopenia and DIC-like picture that has low fibrinogen, but there won't be any classical hypertriglyceridemia or hyperferritinemia. Moreover, in APML, you will see that on peripheral smear, you will see the abnormal cell rather than this just pancytopenia. You will be able to see some abnormal cells out there, right? So the correct answer here would be HLH. Moving to the next question, a 5-year-old boy who was started on induction chemotherapy for acute lymphoblastic leukemia (ALL) develops acute abdominal pain on day 14 of the chemotherapy. On an abdominal examination, there is abdominal tenderness and Cullen sign is also positive. The most likely therapeutic drug which can be implicated is, we have 4 options: vincristine, daunorubicin, L-asparginase, and methotrexate. First of all, acute abdominal pain post chemotherapy for ALL. Think of acute pancreatitis that is caused by L-asparginase. So the correct answer over here is L-asparginase. Here the child exactly shows the classical features, right? The child develops acute abdominal pain, abdominal tenderness, or during the induction therapy of ALL. Also Cullen sign, that is a bluish ecchymosis, purplish ecchymosis in the periumbilical region. Usually it indicates that there is some sort of retroperitoneal hemorrhage. So all of this is classical of the side effects that we encountered with L-asparginase, right? So the very important side effect is your pancreatitis, acute pancreatitis. And the second one is this thrombosis, bleeding leading to your Cullen sign, right? So a very important table I have with me regarding the important chemotherapeutic agents, specifically in pediatric cancers, that you need to know their mechanism and what is their adverse effect. L-asparginase we have just discussed. So the key adverse effect here is acute pancreatitis, hyperglycemia, and thrombosis. We have vincristine, where the major side effect would be peripheral neuropathy, foot drop, paralytic ileus, SIADH. Daunorubicin have cardiotoxicity, methotrexate, mucositis, myelosuppression, and corticosteroids, hypertension, hyperglycemia, avascular necrosis of the femoral head, and psychosis. Right? So, an important side effect you need to know of each of these categories. Moving to the next question. We have a 5-year-old boy who was started on the treatment for Burkitt's lymphoma. He develops acute onset respiratory distress, decreased urine output. Investigations reveal that the hemoglobin is 8, TLC 15,000, platelet 1 lakh, potassium is 6.5, calcium is 6.7, creatinine is 2, and the most important drug for the emergency management over here is dexamethasone, broad spectrum antibiotics, rasburicase, folinic acid rescue. So this is a typical scenario when we give chemotherapy to tumors that have high cell turnover, then there is rapid lysis of the cells leading to tumor lysis syndrome. So if there is multiple destructions of cell, what is going to happen? What is going to happen? there's going to be release of the potassium, right? So, and also some other problems are going to happen. There will be, because the DNA material is also going destroyed, there will be hyperuricemia. Because of the consumption of the calcium, there will be hypocalcemia. So you should know this criteria for tumor lysis syndrome that is given by this Cairo-Bishop criteria. Right? So remember these three numbers. What are these three numbers? 876. Remember, in TLS, everything will increase except the calcium. So calcium, let's write in the middle. Calcium is in the middle, right? Uric acid above, and potassium below. So I told you everything will increase except the calcium. So the cutoff says calcium less than 7, uric acid more than 8, potassium more than 6. Can you see all of the criteria have been fulfilled over here? Apart from that, we see phosphate also. Phosphate more than 6.5 from the baseline is also considered under this criteria. So lab TLS, we say when we see at least 2 or more abnormal values within 3 days or 7 days after starting the chemotherapy. And clinical TLS, we say if we have this lab TLS but at least one clinical complication like renal insufficiency, arrhythmias, sudden death, seizures. So you can see over here clinical TLS, right? We have this respiratory distress, decreased urine output, that means affection of our kidneys, and we also have the parameters over here. Can you see the calcium is 6.7 and the potassium is also 6.5? So 2 abnormal criteria and 1 clinical criteria is also there. So what is the management strategy over here? So emergency point of view, we give aggressive hydration without any added potassium. So aggressive IV fluids without any added potassium. Usually we go for hypotonic saline, 2.5 to 3 liter per meter square per day. And for cardiac stabilization, for hypokalemia, you can give calcium gluconate IV, and calcium replacement, remember, we do not do unless there is any symptomatic hypocalcemia features like tetany, seizures. And the most important drug of choice here is RAS uricase, right? So RAS uricase, mechanism of action, you all know it is a recombinant urate oxidase or uricase. So it will catalyze the conversion of the uric acid into the allantoin, which is actually more water soluble and can be excreted through the kidneys. So RAS uricase is the drug of choice over here, option C, right? So this is about the lab criteria that we discussed, and this is the Cairo-Bishop criteria. I told you calcium less than 7, uric acid more than 8, potassium more than 6, and phosphate more than 6.5, right? Emergency management would be IV hyperhydration, cardiac stabilization, and RAS uricase is the drug of choice over here. Moving to the next question, again a favorite question related to our community pediatrics, that is human milk. So we consider the following statements regarding human milk banking. Option 1, the first statement says that the banks accept voluntarily milk donations from the lactating mothers who are given nominal parents governed by the law. This is false, right? Donating the human milk is completely altruistic. There no payment or incentive has to be given to such mothers. Why we are not giving such incentives? Because there are chances that there can be now adulteration of that human milk then, right? So it's better that this stays altruistic. Second is donor mothers are screened via blood test for HIV, hepatitis B and C, similar to the blood donation, which is correct. Pasteurized donor milk reduces the chances of NEC in preterm neonates. Again, correct statement. Pasteurized donor milk is non-inferior to fresh mother's own milk, which is false, right? Remember, mother's own milk is the only best milk. Apart from that, any other substitute is inferior. So the wrong statements would be 1 and 4 and correct statement would be 2 and 3. So option B would be the correct statement over here, right? Moving to the next question. A term neonate weighing 2 kg delivered to a primary gravida mother through vaginal route and through cleared liquor is found gasping Respiratory efforts are performing, gasping respiratory efforts after performing the initial steps in the delivery room. The next step in resuscitation is a typical flow scenario. If the child term, tone, cry, you check term, tone, cry, right? Whenever a child is born, you check term, tone, cry. If answer to any of those is no, you go for initial steps of resuscitation. And if initial steps of resuscitation also fail, then we go towards positive pressure ventilation, right? And in this scenario, as the child is gasping, you will initiate positive pressure ventilation. And how you are going to do that? Because this is a term neonate weighing 2 kg, I'm not going to use 30% oxygen, I'm going to use room and air. Let's look at the other option also. The first says initial positive pressure ventilation using 30% oxygen, wrong. Intubate and initiate, again wrong with 30% oxygen. Intubate and initiate in positive pressure ventilation using room air, again I would prefer this one because intubation takes time, so initially you start with this bag and mask ventilation. Option C would be the best option over here. Moving to the next question, a newborn delivered at 37 weeks of gestation and birth weight 2.7 kgs presented 12 hours of life with bilious vomiting. The respiratory rate is 36, heart rate is 110, CRT less than 3 seconds, and there is abdominal distension. The abdominal radiograph reveals multiple air fluid levels with absent distal gas pattern. The most likely etiology is, so you can clearly see over here, there is bilious vomiting. So the obstruction definitely is below the duodenum, right? Below the ampulla of water. And the abdominal radiograph also says that there are multiple air fluid levels, absent distant gas pattern. So this is most likely your jejunal adrenal atresia. Let's rule out the other options. So in volvulus, you will definitely see that typical sigmoid coffee bean shape. In congenital hypertrophic pyloric stenosis, there is non-bilious vomiting. And in NEC, initially, what do you see? You see abdominal distension, you will see bloody stools, nothing like that is given over here, so it's wrong. Right? And pneumatosis intestinalis, air under diaphragm, all of these scenarios would be there. But the scenario that is mentioned in the exam is setting with jejunal ileal atresia. Moving to the next question. Consider the following statements regarding the management of tracheoesophageal fistula in neonates. The first statement says that the baby should be nursed in prone position. Prone means ulta. This should never be done. Baby should always be supine or propped up, especially in this scenario because we don't want any reflux to happen. So this is the wrong statement. Second says the neonate should be kept nil perorally and started on IV fluids, which is true. We do not want child to aspirate or reflux into the airway. That's why we keep the child nil perorally and start IV fluids. Neonates need continuous oral suction using a slow suction device. This is true when there is a blind pouch. We do not want to build up an infection there, so we either use a slow suction device or gently aspirate from time to time. So this is the correct statement. Surgery should be planned once the neonate attains 2.5 kg weight, which is a wrong statement. When we know that this is tracheoesophageal fistula, we do not wait for the child to gain weight, right? Child will never gain weight because he won't get that definitive nutrition over here, right? So we don't wait for the child to attain this weight. We operate as soon as possible. So the correct statement you can see over here are 2 and 3 only. Option C would be correct, right? So let's move to the next question. We have an apparently well-nailed neonate who is delivered via the vaginal route in the hospital. He is discharged on day 2 of life. He is brought to the outpatient on day 4 of life as the mother complains of pink staining of the diapers. Pink staining of the diapers. So we have pink staining of the diapers. There is no bleeding from the urethra or per rectum noticed during the examination. The urine dipstick test for RBC is also negative. The baby is appearing playful and active. The most likely etiology of pink staining of diapers over here is porphyria, urate crystals in the urine, hemoglobinuria or hematuria. So you can see this is an apparently well baby. The only complaint over here is that there is pink staining of diapers. So this is a very benign thing. This is nothing but urate crystals, right? So here the correct answer is that there is urate crystals in the urine. Typically you see this brick like color or pink orange staining of the diaper, typically in the first week of life. This is a very self limiting conditions you can see in healthy neonates. Actually, this happens because neonates have a high fractional excretion of the uric acid. So during the first few days, the milk supply is actually establishing because there is colostrum phase, the urine volume is relatively low and concentrated urine is there. That's why you can sometimes see the precipitated uric acid within the urine, and that gives that brick dust or salmon color stain that mothers often can notice over the diapers. And let's rule out other option also. We have a negative dipsticks test for urine, so that rule out your hematuria, you rules out hemoglobinuria, and in porphyria, you are not going to see this condition. Uh, Porphyria definitely can cause reddish spots or port wine stains in the urine. But apart from that, there is going to be photosensitivity, blistering, anemia. The child won't be otherwise healthy, right? So again, goes against in the fever. The typical answer over here is that it is a benign condition. There are just urate crystals in the urine. You counsel the mother that as a child grows, milk supply improves, the baby is well hydrated, the kidneys mature, you're no longer going to see this urate clusters or pink staining of the diapers. So moving to the next question, we have a preterm neonate who is brought to the emergency and the body temperature is noted to be 32. That means the child is cold and hypothermia. Which one of the following metabolic complications is unlikely? The options we have are metabolic alkalosis, hypoglycemia, hyperbilirubin, and hypoxemia. So whenever we talk about neonatal hypothermia, a very important topic, neonatal hypothermia. What all do you see in neonatal hypothermia? What is the normal temperature range first? The normal range, if we talk about neonates, is 36.5 to 37.5 degrees Celsius. This is the normal body temperature. We say the child is in cold stress if the temperature goes down to 36 to 36.5 degrees Celsius. Then you have moderate hypothermia. The moderate hypothermia range is 32 to 35 point, 35.9 degrees Celsius, and severe would be less than 32 degrees Celsius. So we don't want child to line down into severe hypothermia. We have to pick in the cold stress condition only, because severe hypothermia is associated with morbidity and mortality. Right? So let's see what happens when the child is cold. What all metabolic problems are going to happen. So firstly, the metabolic picture, what is going to be there? So whenever there is hypothermia, there's going to be vasoconstriction. So this vasoconstriction will decrease the blood supply, blood flow. So because of this decrease in the blood supply, will there be anaerobic respiration or aerobic? There is poor perfusion, there is hypoxia, so there is going to be anaerobic glycolysis. Because of this anaerobic glycolysis, the byproduct that we have is lactic acid. So we are going to have metabolic acidosis. So this is the first point, metabolic acidosis. Right? Second, there will be hypoglycemia. Because of the massive consumption of the glycogen stores, because of the non-shivering thermogenesis that happens, there is glycogen depletion. So the second thing would be hypoglycemia. Right? Third thing, we all know hypoxemia, there will be decrease in the oxygen saturation, hypoxemia. And fourth, because during cold stress, what happens? The free fatty acids are released. So these free fatty acids displace the bilirubin from the albumin binding sites, leading to hyperbil condition. Right? So these are the important pointers. So now let's look at the options. Metabolic alkalosis, we just discussed. We see metabolic acidosis, not alkalosis. So this is unlikely. Other options are correct. We see hypoglycemia, hyperbil, hypoxemia. Right? So this is all about the metabolic complications that you see in neonatal hypothermia. Now let's move to the next question. We have a 3-year-old boy who's brought to the outpatient department with the complaints of developmental delay. So this is a 3-year-old boy with developmental delay. He can feed himself a biscuit, can draw a line, can climb steps, but only says bisyllables. Which one of the following developmental screening tools is not suitable for him? So, whenever we talk about these developmental assessment kits, what is important for you to know is the age group targets for which these tests are designed. That's what the examiner is trying to test. So, let's discuss. Firstly, we have this Vartex-Baroda test. This is for 0 to 30 months, that is birth to 2.5 years of age. Then you have ASQ3, that is Ages and Stages Questionnaire 3. This is for 1 month to 66 months. So that means birth to up to 5.5 years. Then you have Trivandrum Developmental Screening Test. This is from 0 to 6 years. Then you have Denver Developmental Screening Test, that is from birth to 6 years. Now let's look at the options. We have a 3-year-old boy, so definitely this Vartex-Baroda screening test will not be suitable for him because this is up to 2.5 years of age, up to 30 months. Rest all this child would be covered under, right? So these are some important targeted range that you should know about. Some pointers that I think you should know. So if you talk about Vartex-Baroda screening test, then it was developed by Dr. Pramila Pathak, which was adapted from the Bailey scale of infant development for Indian infants. It has 25 test items that have motor, mental, and adaptive development. The only limitation is that it is limited up to 30 months, that is 2.5 years of age. That's why in this child, which is 3 years of age or 36 months, we cannot apply. Then you have Ages and Stages Questionnaire. This is a widely used test. It has 21 interval specific questionnaires that covers 1 month of age till 5.5 years of age. Then you have Trivandrum Developmental Screening Test. This is developed in our own Trivandrum CDC, Child Developmental Center, which is validated out there. It has a simple graphical item block to identify just developmental delays across the first 6 years of life in the community setting. And lastly, you have this Denver scale. It has 4 functional streams: personal, social, fine motor, adaptive, language, and gross motor. Right? So this is about the developmental screening test. Now let's move to the next question. Development is a very important aspect for UPSC CMS exam because especially as a community center setting and in PSC, you need to screen for these. So let's move to this next question. We have a 8-year-old girl who is provided with this few cubes and asked to create the structure that is provided. You can see the structure A. Structure A is a bridge, 5-gated bridge, right? 5-gated bridge. Then you have option structure B, which is staircase. So this child, this 8-year-old girl, can make structure A but cannot make structure B. So what would be her developmental question? So what is developmental question? Can you tell me what is developmental question? A simple formula is developmental question is developmental age divided by chronological age into 100, right? Developmental age is that age at which that particular milestone should be achieved, and chronological age is that particular age of the child at which the child developed that question. So chronological age in the question over here is 8 years of age. So now let's see when does these milestone appear. So this 5-gated bridge is usually mastered around 4 years of age, 4 to 4.5 years of age, and the staircase is achieved around 6 years of age. So this child can make up till 4 years of age, right? So developmental age is 4 years, whereas chronological age is 8 years. So DQ would be 50%. 50%. So the correct answer here is 50%. So can you tell what type of developmental delay is there? Is there a severe developmental delay? Mild developmental delay? What type of developmental delay is this? So this DQ 50% falls into the category of moderate developmental delay, right? So 35 to 50% or 49% is mild delay, moderate delay, sorry, right? Mild would be 50 to 70, 35 to 50 is moderate, and below that is severe delay. Moving to the next question, we have a 2-year-old boy who was brought to the emergency with his mother noticed that he has developed dusky appearance and lethargy over the past 6 to 8 hours. The child had been prescribed some medication for vomiting by a local practitioner. Examination revealed that the child had normal sized pupils reacting to the light, GCS is 9, there is shallow breathing with cyanosis. EBG revealed that PaO2 is 80 and SpO2 is 60. Which of the following drugs may be implicated? The options we have are domperidone, granisetron, aprepitant, and metoclopramide. So, what is this scenario happening? What is the scenario happening? Look at the saturation gap. The PaO2 appears normal, it's 80, but the saturation is 90. This is the classical textbook case of nothing but methemoglobinemia. What do you see in methemoglobinemia? You see the saturation gap, right? Usually what happens are pulse oximeters, they overestimate or underestimate the absorbance when the methemoglobin is elevated, right? So you see this gap. PO2 measures the oxygen that is dissolved in your plasma, that is unaffected by hemoglobin abnormalities. So wherever you see this wide discrepancy of the saturation, the SpO2, and you see a normal or high dissolved oxygen, that is PaO2, this is saturation gap, and this is hallmark of methemoglobinemia. And what the clinical features that collaborate over here, which is given over here? You see this dusky appearance, dusky or bluish appearance that does not actually resolve to your oxygen therapy. You see lethargy. You can see over here there is lethargy, the GCS is poor 9, there's shallow breathing. And also, if you look at the blood sample also appears very chocolate brown or darkish in color. And the drug over here, which is notoriously known to cause this methemoglobinemia, is metoclopramide. Right. Apart from that, you should know some other drugs too. What are these other drugs? In antiemetics, we have metoclopramide. Apart from that, in local anesthetics, we have prilocaine, benzocaine. We have dapsone, sulfonamides from primaquine, chloroquine, the ship drugs. We have nitrates, nitrites. All of these are known to cause methemoglobinemia. And what is the drug of choice to cure it? The child is blue, and the drug that we give is also blue. The treatment of choice is methylene blue. We give 1 to 2 mg per kg over 5 minutes. It is an electron donor for this NADPH methemoglobin reductase enzyme, right? This is the treatment of choice. So let's move to the next question. We have a 12-year-old boy who is brought to the emergency in an unconscious state. There is history of shallow breathing and increasing drowsiness over the last 2 hours. He is noticed to have dry mouth, cold extremities, his limp, pinpoint pupils, and the emergency physician is suspecting poisoning. Which of the following antidotes should be administered? So look at the case scenario. A typical toxidrome you can notice over here. What is this typical toxidrome? This is opioid toxidrome. CNS depression, you see unconscious state, increasing drowsiness, limpness, hypotonia. You see respiratory depression, shallow breathing, hypoventilation. You see meiosis, pinpoint pupils. All of these. Apart from that, cold extremities is another sign. Dry mouth, that is decreased secretions. So all of these are sign of your classical opioid toxidrome. And we all know what is the antidote for that. The antidote for that is naloxone, right? With that, now let's just revise these important poisonings that the examiner can happen. The first one we have discussed, the opioid overdose. You will see a triad: CNS depression, respiratory depression, pinpoint pupil. The specific antidote we have is naloxone. It is a pure competitive opioid receptor antagonist. Second is benzodiazepine poisoning. Here again you will see CNS depression. Pupils here will be normal to sluggish. Vitals would be normal. Flumazenil is the typical antidote over here. In OP poisoning, the typical mnemonic, sludge or dumbbells. You see pinpoint pupils, excessive salivation, fasciculation. Atropine is the drug of choice as an antidote. And lastly, if there is anaphylaxis or severe arrest, then Adri would be the antidote. Moving to the next question, image-based question, we have a neonate who has bilious vomiting. That means the obstruction would be somewhere below the duodenum. At 6 hours of life with abdominal distension, that X-ray is ordered, and this gives a typical double bubble appearance, as you can see. The condition here is pyloric stenosis, esophageal atresia, duodenal atresia, or Hirschsprung disease. No-brainer, double bubble sign, bilious vomiting. This is nothing but duodenal atresia. Moving to the next question. A child is brought with the complaints of involuntary, non-rhythmic, jerky movements of the upper limb and snorting sound. So there is involuntary movements, jerky movements. Along with that, there are snorting sounds also. So this is definitely sounding like tics. And the duration they have given that this is noticed for the past 12 months. MRI, EEG are normal, and the child is mocked by the classmates in the school. And so he has stopped attending the classes for the past 6 months. ASLO titers and serum ceruloplasmin are non-contributing. What would be the ideal therapy? Trial of oral clonidine, methylphenidate, oral benzodiazepines, or olanzapine. So can you look at the typical scenario over here? You see a text-like picture, right? There is vocal text also, and there is some motor text also. Combination, multiple motor text along with this phonic text, snortic sounds. The duration is also given more than 1 year, 12 months. The onset should be before 18 years of age. Here the age group is 6 years. EEG, brain, everything is normal. They have excluded all other things also. They have excluded syndendum choreas. ASLO titers are negative, normal ceruloplasmin. So this is not Wilson's also. And because there is bullying and he has stopped going to the school also, that means it needs to significant functional and social impairment too. So it fills all the criteria of Tourette syndrome. Tourette syndrome. Right? Tourette syndrome. So as we discussed, the Tourette syndrome, multiple non-vocal tics, at least one vocal tics. Duration, firstly is tics, motor plus vocal. Then we have duration, 1 year. Then the third pointer is onset. Onset should be before the age of 18 years. Then there should be exclusion of other causes. Exclude other causes. And lastly, there should be functional or social impairment. Functional or social impairment. All of these we see over here. So the diagnosis we have established, Tourette syndrome. So now the examiner is asking what would be the ideal therapy over here. So if you look at the ideal therapy, first line is non-pharmacological treatment, in which we do psychotherapy, psychoeducation and behavioral therapy. But when we talk about pharmacotherapy, the first line is alpha-2 adrenergic agonist like clonidine or guanfacine. If that's refractory, we go to second line therapy, which is antipsychotic. So in the options over here, the correct answer is going to be oral clonidine. Why not other options? Can you look at the other options? Firstly, we have methylphenidate. Methylphenidate we use for ADHD, right? For tics, it is not a direct treatment. It can actually worsen the tics in some patient. Oral benzodiazepines, while we go for atypical antipsychotics, but these oral benzodiazepines or olanzapines, they are not standard first line therapies, right? So let's move to the next question. We are done with Tourette's. We have a 4-year-old unimmunized HIV positive child on antiretroviral therapy for the past 2 years. Weighing 15 kgs brought to the vaccination. His recent records says that the CD4 count is 750 with no evidence of any opportunistic infections in the past. Which of the following statement is applicable to this child? So when we talk about vaccination, again a very important topic of UPSC CMS. This is an overlap topic with pediatrics and community medicine, and I'll urge you to read it again and again if you are preparing or targeting for this UPSC CMS exam. So let's go through the statements. The first statement says that recombinant hepatitis B vaccine can be safely administered over here. The second option says that MMR vaccine is always contraindicated. Third option says BCG can be administered if the chest radiograph is normal. And fourth option says IPV is preferred over OPV. So if you look at this child, this is a child who is unimmunized but is HIV positive, right? So immunodeficiency background is there. But can you notice the CD4 count is well good, 750, and also there is no evidence of any opportunistic infection. No evidence of any opportunistic infection. So what is the guideline? What are the general guidelines says? The general guideline says that if usually when we have these unimmunized, immunocompromised children, or who have a predisposition to acquire the infections, then we can, in these children, inactivated and killed vaccine can be safely given, right? So inactivated and killed vaccines can be safely given. What about the live vaccine? Can we give live vaccine? So live vaccines would be conditional. If there is no severe immunosuppression, then we can give vaccines like MMR or varicella. Apart from that, vaccines like BCG, OPV, yellow fever vaccines, they are contraindicated because they can lead to severe disseminated disease like BCGiosis. And in places of OPV, we prefer inactivated one, IPV, right? So these are the few guidelines that that should be there in your mind. So first option says that recombinant hepatitis B vaccine can be safely given, which is true because it is actually an inactivated subunit vaccine. So we can give that. This is true. Second says MMR vaccine is always contraindicated, which is false. Remember, in these cases, MMR can be safely given if the CD4 count is well. That means the CD4 count is more than 200 in cases of children more than 5 years of age, or more than 500 in cases of children of less than 5 years of age, right? So smaller children more than 500, after 5 years more than 200. Here we have 750, so no problem, we can give over here. BCG can be administered at the chest, a radiograph is normal. This is a false statement. This is an incorrect statement because I told you that BCG is contraindicated. It is a live attenuated vaccine. It is strictly contraindicated because of the chances of disseminated BCG disease. So irrespective of the chest radiograph, irrespective of the CD4 count, you do not give BCG. And the fourth option says that IPV is preferred over OPV, which is true because IPV, we all know, it is an inactivated form, so better. So statement 1 and 4 is correct, option C, right? So these are the important pointers regarding these vaccines in immunocompromised children. Moving to the next scenario, we have a 2-year-old child who's brought with the complaints that he's not growing well. On examination, you see that he weighs just 8.1 kg. His height is 80 centimeter. That lies, wait for length score between 0 and -2. He has a mid-arm, upper arm circumference of 11.5 and both of his palms are white. There is no edema. As per IMNCI, what would be his classification? So if you look at the IMNCI classification, then we have something known as SAM, that is severe acute malnutrition. We have MAM, that is moderate acute malnutrition. Then you have no acute malnutrition or normal nutrition. So SAM criteria you all understand. We need either of the three, right? Either MUAC less than 11.5 or nutritional edema, or weight for height less than -3 standard deviation. So here none of these criteria is met. So this child is definitely not SAM. What about MAM? What happens in MAM? Moderate acute malnutrition. Here MUAC is in between 11.5 to 12.4 centimeter. Here the weight for height would lie in between -2 to -3 standard deviation, right? And lastly, you have no malnutrition. Here the MUAC will be more than 12.5 centimeter and weight for height will be more than -2 standard deviation. So here you can notice the weight for height is matching the criteria of MAM. And the second thing they're asking is about anemia. So anemia, again, IMNCI guidelines has divided into severe anemia or no anemia. Severe anemia would be when both the palms look pale, bleached, completely white. If there is some mild pallor, then it would be just anemia. No anemia if there is no pallor. So here they are saying the palms are white. So that means there is severe anemia. So the correct answer here should be moderate acute malnutrition and severe anemia, right? So important IMNCI charts. If not yet, you have not yet gone through them, please open your GHI textbook. The back side has all of these IMNCI charts. Go through them thoroughly, right? Moving to the next question, we have a 2-year-old child who is previously unimmunized, is brought with poor feeding and fever for 6 days. On day 4 of fever, her mother noticed that there is a maculopapular reddish rash that started from the face, spreading over the neck, chest, arms, and trunks over the next one day. And she has developed extensive mouth ulcers also. This child has a mid-upper arm circumference of 11 centimeters but no edema. As per IMNCI, she will be classified as measles with eye or mouth complications, measles, severe complicated measles, measles with severe acute malnutrition. So again, if you look at the IMNCI classification framework, then they have divided this child with measles depending upon the history into 3 categories. We have severe complicated measles, measles with eye or mouth complications, and just measles. So if you see any of the danger signs, child is unable to feed, vomits everything, clouding of the cornea, there is deep extensive mouth ulcers, this is severe complicated measles. So in this scenario, they have given all of these danger signs. They have given that the child is not feeding, there is poor feeding, there is extensive mouth ulcers. So this is nothing but severe complicated measles. The hair treatment would be urgent referral, give first dose of vitamin A, give first dose of IV or IV antibiotics, apply tetracycline eye ointment, and urgent referral. Then you have measles with eye or mouth complications. Here you have this rash. Along with that, mouth ulcers there, but not that deep, pus draining from the eye. Here OPD based treatment can be given with oral antibiotics. And lastly, you have measles without any complications. Here just supportive treatment and vitamin E supplementation has to be given. So the correct answer over here, because there is poor feeding, danger sign, there is extensive mouth ulcer, so this is nothing but severe complicated measles. Severe complicated measles. Though the child also has no edema, but MUAC is less, this child has SAM, but it can come under the umbrella term of severe complicated measles. Right? So the correct answer here would be C. Moving to the next question, we have a 10-week-old infant who is taken to a PHC by his or her mother for vaccination. The infant has taken all the doses as per the recommended schedule. At 6 weeks, the infant was prescribed rotavirus. After 3 days of getting the vaccine, the mother reported that the child suffered an episode of epilepsy. On inquiring, it was found that the infant also had a history of 2 epileptic episodes in the week prior to the immunization, that is 9th week. Considering the scenario, which of the following statement is correct regarding adverse event following immunization? This was a vaccine product related AEFI, it is immunization error related AEFI, immunization stress related AEFI, or it is a coincidental event. So this is definitely a coincidental event. Earlier also this child had epilepsy and now he has received the vaccine, and after 3 days the child again has repeated epilepsy. So this has nothing to be related with vaccine. This is a coincidental event. So you should know these categories. First is the coincidental event. It is temporarily linked simply because it happened around the time of vaccination. Then you have vaccine product related. This is due to the components or inherent properties of the vaccine. For example, the swelling that you see with DPT, febrile seizures that can be due to the vaccine induced fever. Then you have immunization error related fever, where you have inappropriate vaccine handling, prescription wrong diluent technique. For example, if there can be production of sterile abscess from injections. Then you have immunization stress related AEFI. Here, usually the symptoms are from stress, right? So vasovagal syncope, fear of injections, hyperventilation, mass hysteria, a lot of things can happen. So these AEFI categories are very important categories. You should be very well thorough with these. So moving to the next question, we have the next question says that all of the following correctly represents the basic criteria for identifying at-risk infants, except birth order 3 and above, twins, failure to gain weight during successive months on artificial feeding. Again, an overlap topic from community medicine and pediatrics. Your PARC textbook has specifically given this at-risk infants. So let's revise what are these at-risk infants. Firstly, biological or birth characteristic. If there is birth weight less than 2.5, that is a low birth weight child. Twin or multiple ones. If there is higher birth order, that means more than 5 or more. Or if the child is born to a mother with bad OBS history, feeding and growth parameters, if the child is bottle fed, artificial fed, non breast milk fed. If there is failure to gain weight in the 3 successive months, there is protein energy malnutrition, persistent diarrhea, chronic respiratory infections, and family factors, social factors. If there is working mother, single mother, illiterate mother, broken family, early death of either parent, problematic family, extreme poverties. So if you go down the questions 10, birth order 3 and above is actually not a basic criteria. Birth order 5 and above is. Twins, failure to gain weight, artificial feeding, all other meet the basic criteria of at-risk infants. So let's move to the next question. So they have this question in 2 parts. The first part says that we have a 6-week-old infant who has history of fever for 2 days, and according to the mother, he's not feeding well. He's taking 2 to 3 breastfeeds in a day, which is actually very less. A child should feed every 2 to 3 hours, so it means 8 to 12 feeds in a day. The infant has diarrhea for the last 2 days, has sunken eyes, so that means the child is dehydrated also, passes draining from the umbilicus, and an infant has respiratory rate of 55 breaths per minute. Which of the following is correct regarding the classification of infant as far as IMNCI guidelines are considered? So again, refer to your IMNCI charts. The option we have are very severe disease, local bacterial infection, no dehydration, or severe dehydration. And the second part says that what is the most appropriate treatment for this infant? Give the first dose of IM antibiotic, refer the child urgently to the hospital, and advise the mother to continue breastfeeding. Advise the mother to give frequent sips of ORS on the way, or teach the mother to give local treatment treat local infection and send home with advice for a follow-up after 2 days. Select the correct answer using the given code. So firstly, you should know what is this very severe disease, what are these IMNCR charts telling us. So whenever you refer to these IMNCR treatment protocols, the 2 main classifications you have are possible serious bacterial infection. This is the first major category, that is also known as very severe disease, which is the pink category, which the child is falling over here. Child is not feeding well, there is poor feeding, there is pus discharge also. And the second category that the child is falling over here is some dehydration. There is sunken eyes, the child has diarrhea. So the very correct option over here is going to be very severe disease. Second thing, what you are going to do over here, give first dose of IM antibiotics, which is true. Second, refer the child urgently to the hospital and advise the mother to continue breastfeeding, again true. Advise the mother to give frequent sips of ORS over the way, again true, so that the child does not land up into severe dehydration. Teach the mother to treat local infection and send home. You cannot send home this child with severe infection, right? So the correct statement over here are going to be 1, 2, and 3, right? So this is my take on the recent UPSC CMS exam. I hope you had a gist of how the examiner is trying to test your knowledge and what are the important topics if you are preparing for this exam. I hope this helps. We'll meet in some other video. All the best for your exam. And if you get a wonderful result, please do connect with us. We'll be more than happy to connect and share your insights. Thank you and have a nice day.